Welcome to the Kaleidoscope. So glad to have you this afternoon. We're so privileged to have Professor Dr. Ben Fitzpatrick with us on this segment of Kaleidoscope. And I am just excited about our theme today. And I just want to share with you that I think you will enjoy this. We'll be right back.
For students living both on and off campus, come check out the new POD store, located in Alumni Tower. POD store is a great way for students on campus to go grocery shopping without leaving campus, or for students looking for a place to spend flex dollars on drinks, snacks, and supplies. Remember, if you're by Alumni Tower, visit the POD store to the right of the catwalk for products on demand when you want them.
Wonder if my package has come in. Sweet, it has.
How can I help you today, sir?
Yeah, I got a package.
What's your dorm address?
811 Cartmel.
811 Cart. See your student ID, please. All right.
Welcome back to Kaleidoscope, and again, we're so glad to have you with us on this segment. And our guest today is Dr. Ben Fitzpatrick. Welcome, Ben.
Oh, thank you for having me back.
So glad to have you back. I just want you to share a little bit before you get into what we're going to talk about today. Just tell us a little bit about how you got here at Morehead State University.
Sort of a long route. I'm originally from Kentucky.
Okay.
I was born and raised down in Somerset, Pulaski County. I did my undergraduate work at Eastern Kentucky University, and then I did my graduate work at the University of Notre Dame.
All right.
The area I focus on is African American history, particularly the domestic slave trade. But I sort of got here sort of a long route. I've taught at different places. I taught for a year as a visiting professor at EKU.
Okay.
Taught for a couple of years down in Florida at Florida State College.
Okay.
And this job just sort of came up. And it was just sort of great because it was back in Kentucky. I was back home. And plus, just being here at Morehead State is just great.
Great. You know, I have truly had, by us both being Kentucky natives, it's just always involves me, and I'm real pleased when we have somebody who is doing research in Kentucky. And I just want to have a little idea, what got you involved in in your interest in the slave trade in Kentucky?
Well, I actually got interested in South Bend when I was at the University of Notre Dame. I was sort of, as a young grad student, I was sort of searching around trying to find a topic, an area that I was interested in. And my advisor studied African American history and slavery, except he looked at it during the colonial period.
Okay.
And roughly about that time, historians started to look at the domestic slave trade.
Wow.
And so both of those things kind of came together. The historiography was sort of moving that way, and my advisor was sort of pushing me that way.
Okay.
But what really got me interested in Kentucky and the slave trade here was reading Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Wow.
Now, I read bits and pieces and parts of it in high school, you know, in the 8th grade, but I never really took a whole lot of notice of it. But once I started reading it, I realized just how central the slave trade in Kentucky was and why Stowe had focused on it, because she understood that people during that period would have understood almost everything that she was saying about the importance of slavery there.
Wow.
So that's really sort of got me interested.
Okay, okay. And so with that being said, I think we've got one of the sites that you had talked about to come up about the Cheapside. I think our cameras will bring that up. Cheapside, yes. Share a little bit with us about this particular slide here.
This is a historical marker that's located at Cheapside in Lexington, Kentucky. And this sort of gives you an idea of just how central or important the slave trade was to Kentucky. By the time we get to about the 1840s, 1850s, Lexington is a major area for the slave trade. Traders from all around central Kentucky would gather in Lexington. They would have their offices, their slave jails, slave pens, and one could go to Cheapside and buy slaves. It was a major slave trading market for central Kentucky, and really for the South.
Wow. That's interesting, I tell you. And then you got another question here I want to ask you about. What is the significance about the Lewis and Milton Clark, and why should their story be told? I see you brought some pictures also of the Lewis and Milton Clark and their focus and impact on this particular era.
Yeah, sure. Lewis and Milton Clark were two brothers that I encountered in my research for my dissertation.
Okay.
They were brothers. They had roughly about 6 or 7 siblings, and they were all slaves in Madison County. But Lewis and Milton ran away in the 1840s, and they wrote their narrative. And this narrative, it's been looked at by lots of historians, but not necessarily sort of picked apart and used in the way that, say, Frederick Douglass's narrative has been used.
Is that this what just was up on the screen?
That's the
okay.
Frontispiece of the narrative. And these two brothers, I mean, they sort of experienced almost every aspect of being involved in the slave trade.
Really?
They were sold. They were mortgaged. You could actually mortgage, one could mortgage a slave if you needed cash. They were hired out. They were able to actually go out and hire and find masters. As a matter of fact, Milton Clark, he traveled up and down the Ohio and Mississippi River playing music on steamboats.
Really?
So that's one of the things that I found out about the slave trade in Kentucky, and one of the things that drew my interest to it is that it's very, very diverse.
Yes. Oh, those are some great pictures of those.
And as you can notice here from these two gentlemen, they are of mixed race.
Yes.
Their mother, which is another reason why I find them interesting, because it sort of gives you a different dynamic on slavery. These two brothers, their father was from Scotland.
Wow.
He came to the colonies during the American Revolution. He fought for the Patriots.
Okay. Came
to Kentucky, and he married a woman who was a slave, and she too was of mixed race.
Wow.
And so these two men sort of throw a whole new light on sort of multiculturalism in some ways.
Right, right. Well, I want you to hold that thought, and we got to come back and talk just a little bit more about Lewis and Clark, because they really sound interesting, and we need to hear a little bit more that you want to share with us on that. So right now we'll take a break, and we'll come right back.
Hey, what you got there?
This is a list of school supplies that I need, and I can't find them.
Wonder where you can find them.
Okay, great. The university books.
That's right, they got everything.
Welcome back to Kaleidoscope, and we're going to continue on with our segment here on the slave trade here in Kentucky with Dr. Ben Fitzpatrick. And again, he had just finished up talking about Lewis Clark. And I guess, Ben, I'd like for you to share a little bit more, and what was the impact that Milton may have contributed to as well. I know they were brothers and that kind of thing, but just kind of, did he stand out in any way, or did they both brothers done something pretty much the same?
Well, this is one of the things that interests me about these two brothers too, is because during their time they were actually sort of semi-famous. They weren't as famous as Frederick Douglass, but once they made their escape, they actually, as I said, wrote their narratives, and those narratives were used as propaganda by the abolitionists. Now,
Wow.
propaganda doesn't necessarily mean that it's false, full of lies, but it was certainly used as a tool or a weapon by the abolitionists to fight against the institution of slavery.
Wow.
And Lewis Clark, he toured throughout New England giving speeches to white folks about his experiences during slavery. And for many of those folks, that was actually the first time they had ever met a slave. So it was very, very powerful to hear about these experiences from someone who had actually lived it. Now, Milton Clark, when he makes his way to Ohio, he actually works as a sort of a conductor, you might say, on the Underground Railroad.
Yeah,
and
wow.
he helped numerous slaves from Kentucky to escape.
All right.
In his narrative, he talks about how he's such the slave holders in Kentucky fear him so much that he's such a wanted man. There's actually a bounty on his head. People, slave catchers, marshals, sheriffs come into Ohio to try to capture him. He's such a threat to masters in Kentucky.
So we pull up that picture again with Milton on there. I'd like for our viewers to see him again. Continue on a little bit more about Milton.
Well, of our two brothers, probably the one that has probably the major influence is Lewis Clark.
Okay, Lewis.
Harriet Beecher Stowe says that Lewis Clark was an influence for one of her characters in Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Okay.
If you ever read A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, this is in addition to writing the novel, she wrote something called A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin. And basically what this book is sort of her research for the book. Because people said, look, Uncle Tom's Cabin is nothing but lies.
Yeah.
This is totally false.
That's right.
Southerners said, right? Well, Harriet Beecher Stowe said, no, it's not. Here's all my research. So it's sort of like her research, her bibliography. And in this key, she talks about talking to Lewis Clark.
Okay.
That she had interviewed him and talked to him. And so his experiences, he is sort of one of the influences for George Harris, one of the major characters in Uncle Tom's Cabin. If you remember, he runs away to the north, and he too is of mixed race. So it's quite possible that she was influenced by Lewis Clark and other slaves like him.
Now, did she do this second book after her first book?
Yeah.
The research she done?
Yeah.
And what do you think prompted her to possibly write that second book in reference to the research?
Well, it's because people come out and said, Southerners came out and said, you know, don't pay any attention to Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's just false. Everything about it's false. And she said, no.
She had to prove it right.
Right.
Okay.
This is not. So you look at all this, and she along with other abolitionists would use Southern newspapers, for example.
Okay.
To say, look, you want to know what slavery is like in the South, pick up any Southern newspaper, look at runaway slave advertisements, look at for sale advertisements, go talk to former slaves. They'll tell you what it was like. So it was sort of her way to prove her critics wrong.
Thank you. All right, then. We're on our roll. We're on a roll here. Folks, we're coming right back with another commercial, and we'll be right back to ask Dr. Fitzpatrick a few more questions about the slave trade in Kentucky.
What's wrong, dude? Second guessing that cheeseburger? Maybe you should take another look at that before you eat it.
Don't eat me.
Now how could you be thinking of eating that when really you're thinking of a slow-cooked chili-covered geodog with cheese with your selected choice of chips? Throw that thing away. Located on the first floor behind the elevator.
What about me?
When you got some homework and you need a place to go, when you're working on a project and your computer is slow, there's a little place on campus that I think that you should know about. The first story of the library is what I'm talking about. Walk past Java City and then you will see the new commons area is where you should be. They got computers and printers, couches, tables and more. It's the perfect place to go for study time galore. Please don't throw that trash on the ground. I know someone is watching you now. Recycle man, recycle man. Please take care of all your waste in a responsible way. Recycle.
Welcome back to Kaleidoscope. And again, we're here with Dr. Ben Fitzpatrick and talking about the slave trade in Kentucky. And at this time, I'm going to ask Dr. Fitzpatrick, tell me about the life of a slave in Kentucky. What have your research showed in reference to the life of a true slave in Kentucky?
Well, oftentimes when we think about slavery, we sort of think about the South as being this monolithic region. In other words, everything was the same. And usually what we think is, well, cotton. Mm-hmm. Well, that's not necessarily true for Kentucky or the Upper South. Okay. Now, for the average slave in the Cotton South, they probably lived on a plantation with 20 or more slaves, maybe even more. But in Kentucky, the average slave lived on a small farm. His master may have owned maybe 1, 2 other slaves. So slaves in Kentucky sort of worked side by side, shoulder to shoulder with their master or along with maybe a couple of other slaves. Now, this leads slaves in Kentucky to lead sort of a different sort of life as far as work is concerned. Okay. In the lower South, in the Cotton Belt, most of those slaves worked with something that you call the gang system. This is a type of labor system that masters used to organize the slaves. And so the slaves would come out at the break of dawn. They work until dark, and then maybe sometime in between there they get 30 minutes of lunch. Okay. Usually you have a white overseer who's in charge of the whole entire operation, and maybe black drivers who sort of supervise the slaves. But in Kentucky with these small farms, basically the slave might work until a task was completed, sometimes called the task system. And so the master might then allow that slave to hire out his own time. Wow. Now, he can maybe move about to find a master, even though that's illegal. It's against state law in Kentucky for a slave to move about on his own to do that. But a master... All alone? All alone. All alone. But masters oftentimes will do that because it makes slavery profitable if there's just not enough work for them to do. But a slave might also be hired out. In other words, a contract will be signed between a master and maybe his neighbor, or maybe a local businessman, maybe a steamboat needs extra labor. Okay. And so slavery in Kentucky is a little bit more diverse than, say, maybe in a place like Mississippi or South Carolina. Yeah, so I was just getting ready to ask you about, because what was the difference? Evidently there was a little bit more freedom in Kentucky versus even deeper south. Well, that's the thing about it. When people talk about slavery in Kentucky, historians, sometimes they talk about it as being more, being light, not being as hard as slavery in the Deep South. I agree. Now, slavery is slavery. Slavery is slavery. It takes a different form, but it's still very, very restrictive in many, many ways. So, for example, you may have slaves who are working in hemp factories. I mean, that's very strenuous work. And some of these slaves who are working in hemp factories are children, they're women. Slaves can't just move about on their own. They have to have restrictions according to the law. So if you're a slave and you want to go from, say, from Lexington to Louisville, you have to have a pass from your master saying where you're going. It describes you, and it also describes when you'll be back. If you don't have a pass and you're picked up by a sheriff or accosted, even by an average white citizen, you can be taken up and taken into jail. So it's this whole, I think the reason why it's considered to be is not as harsh is because Kentucky doesn't rely on cotton. But that doesn't necessarily make it so. I mean, being a slave is still being a slave. Yeah, because in that we don't rely on cotton, what was the noted thing that the slaves basically had to work with here? Well, for Kentucky, like I said, it's a very diverse economy. So if we go to, say, the eastern part of the state, we don't find a whole lot of slaves. There's not a whole lot of arable land in the mountains, and so for the most part, the slave population there would have been very small. If we move over to the western part of the state, we find large population of slaves, say in Christian County or Todd County, where you have tobacco that's being grown. So tobacco is an important staple crop for Kentucky, and you find slaves working in that. But really, if you're looking for sort of the center of slaveholding in Kentucky, it is the bluegrass region, that sort of Lexington, Louisville corridor. And in central Kentucky, it's hemp. Hemp. Hemp is sort of the major crop in Kentucky in the 1830s, 1840s.
Okay.
And slaves were sort of used to cultivate it exclusively almost. And hemp is used in hemp rope, rope walks. In places like Louisville, Lexington, the hemp is taken there where the fibers are then turned into a rope.
Okay.
And this rope, oftentimes these factories have contracts with the U.S. Navy.
Wow.
So this rope goes to used in ships or steamboats. Okay. But also, this hemp is turned into cotton bagging. You know, every time we see the slaves in the cotton fields, but that bagging was made out of hemp, which came from Kentucky. So even though Kentucky doesn't rely on cotton, it's still connected in some ways to cotton cultivation.
That really sounds interesting. That in talking about that, I was truly interested in. I heard about the hemp before, so that is a good thing. And we've got some more questions for you. But right now, we're going to take a commercial break, and we'll be right back with a few more questions with Dr. Ben Fitzpatrick on the slave trade in Kentucky.
When you're thirsty, are you going to depend on a crumpled old dollar? Remind yourself to always bring your Eagle card.
Dude, you need the Eagle card.
Always keep beaker bucks loaded onto your Eagle card just in case. It's the fastest way to make all of your on-campus purchases.
Welcome back to Kaleidoscope, and again we're still with Dr. Ben Fitzpatrick on the slave trade in Kentucky. And I got another question for you, Dr. Fitzpatrick. This one is about how did the slave trade operate in Kentucky? Share a little bit with us about that. And I think we've got some documents that you shared with us too in reference to that.
Well, the slave trade, in many scary ways, operated just like a business, any business that we would recognize today. We saw one example of that with the Cheapside, which is sort of a, I guess you might say, sort of an open-air market where you could go and buy slaves. There are sort of a couple dimensions to the slave trade. You have the interstate slave trade, right, where slaves are being sold between the states, usually from the upper South to the lower South. And in this interstate slave trade, it's places like New Orleans, Natchez, Mississippi. They are the major markets. But probably prior to 1840 or so, what's really most important for Kentucky is the intrastate trade. In other words, slaves being traded within the state. And so once again, what you see is sort of a dynamic sort of mechanisms that are occurring. Slaves can be sold, they're being hired, they might be hired for a day,
What is
a week.
this we're looking at now here, the pictures that are coming up here?
This looks like a receipt for a slave that has been sold, if I remember correctly. I think this is a receipt for a mother and her 2 children who were bought by a man named C.W. Thruston. I did some research at the Filson Historical Society in Louisville, and the Thruston papers are located there.
Yeah, that's where that background is there.
And C.W. Thruston, he owned one of those rope walks in Louisville. And one of the things that I found looking at his papers, he oftentimes hired children, women, and slave men to work in these rope walks. And if I remember correctly from that document, he bought a woman named Tabitha and her 2 young children for like $500.
Very good. I think we've got some photos on some the ads, runaway ads, or the that you brought to us too. You have some of those, the runaway ads, to show our viewers.
Yeah, these these newspaper advertisements came in a different varieties.
There we go.
If I remember correctly, this is I think it's the Louisville It's a Louisville newspaper. I know that it's a Louisville newspaper.
You think it's the Courier?
It could be the Courier. I'm not.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
But I got this at the Regenstein Library. I was doing some research at the University of Chicago.
I see.
And these newspaper advertisements come in different varieties as well, and they're a very important part of the slave trade. If a master wanted to hire, say, a woman, a domestic, he would put an ad in the newspaper looking to hire a woman.
Right.
Also, slave traders who were looking to buy slaves, they would put ads in the newspaper to advertise that they were looking to buy slaves that they could ship down to the lower South. But probably I guess the most the advertisement that sort of stands out to you when you read these newspapers are the runaway advertisements.
The runaway.
Yeah. Whenever a slave ran away, a master would then put out an advertisement. Okay. And the reward just depended on the value of the slave. If the slave had a skill, if the slave was healthy, likely as they would have called, the reward would have been more. And these advertisements are probably one of the most important tools that I've found in sort of researching slaves and African Americans, because slaves, they don't receive a whole lot of education. If they do, it's sort of clandestine, so they don't leave a whole lot of written records. But these advertisements, masters had to be really honest about these slaves, about their personalities, family that they had. Okay. So it's almost like reading a mini biography of these people in some ways. Right. So the masters had to be real honest in order to capture them. And
we've got just a few more questions for you. And then also, how important was the Kentucky in the domestic slave trade?
Kentucky is crucial, and that's one of the reasons why Harriet Beecher Stowe chose Kentucky. She understood that the average person would have understood Kentucky sort of being at the center. The thing about it is that by the time we get to the 1830s, 1840s, cotton cultivation has begun to spread westward across the Black Belt, what we call the Cotton Belt today. And there was this immense need for labor. Now, masters who moved into that area couldn't always bring enough slaves with them. So where do they get them from? Well, they get them from states in the upper South, places like Virginia, also some little bit of North Carolina, but particularly Kentucky. And so masters in Kentucky sort of see the lower South as this very important outlet for excess slaves that they don't want. Okay. And just to sort of give you an idea, the prices of slaves in Kentucky are connected to the prices of cotton.
Yes, there they are. Yeah,
are connected to the prices of cotton in the lower South. So once again, even though Kentucky is not a cotton-producing state, it is still very important in how it sort of shapes its economy.
We got about 30 seconds, real quick. How would you describe the lives of the free blacks in Kentucky?
The lives of free blacks certainly circumscribed. In many ways, they share a lot of the conditions that slaves do, even though they're free. Not a lot of access to education. A free black might be educated in Sunday school, or he might find some benevolent organization that's willing to educate them. But for the most part, when we look at free blacks, we find them in cities. Lexington, Louisville, and what they do is they sort of create their own vibrant communities. Ministers, churches sort of become the center of those communities, and they basically sort of do the best that they can under these horrible conditions.
Right. Well, I tell you, you are such a wealth of knowledge on this. This really has informed us and really somewhat enlightened us and educated us in reference to the slave trade in Kentucky. This is not over. We're going to hopefully have another segment here where we can talk a little bit more about this. But I want to thank you, Dr. Fitzpatrick, for coming on Kaleidoscope and sharing this information with us and getting us enlightened and educated in reference to the slave trade in Kentucky.
Oh, thank you for having me.
We want to thank you, and thank you, viewers, for coming in. Have a safe, and at this time we'll go back to with the commercial.